Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 17. Suspicion and Doubts. Weiss. Weiss was stood on her balcony, the crisp winter winds blowing gently through her hair causing her neck to tingle pleasantly, and thought on how quickly the end of the year had flown by. It was hard for her to believe that it was already December, already 3 months since her 18th birthday, 2 months since meeting Yang, and herself starting to take a more active role in the company. It was very rare for her to find herself wishing for time to slow down, but for the first time in a long time, she was. The past 2 months had been the most amazing she could remember, mostly in part due to Yang. The mere thought of the blonde bringing a smile to her face as she looked out over the mansion's gardens and watched as the gardener tended to the rose bushes her mother had abandoned long ago. How could it not? Everything about Yang was perfect to Weiss. Her smile, the way it lit up her beautiful lilac eyes, and always managed to tease one from her, no matter what mood she was in. The way she treated people, with so much effortless compassion that it inspired Weiss to try her best to be a good person too. The best thing, however, was how easy everything felt to Weiss when they were together. While previous relationships had always felt tense, Weiss' status as the heiress to one of the world's largest companies always ended up affecting how she was treated, but with Yang it never did. She asked about the company, of course, and frequently made attempts to show some interest, but it was always when Weiss had bought it up. A vast majority of the time, Yang treated her as a normal girl. No special treatment, not like she was important because she was Weiss, but because she was Weiss. And her work at the company, she loved every moment of that too. While Yang made her feel loved and supported, the company gave her purpose. She was now actively making a difference, actively making progress in returning the company to what her grandfather had started. The chip, while still a long ways off, was important to her for more reasons than she had told Dr. Polendina. Sure, she wanted it to be a turning point, something that showed she was breaking away from all the atrocities her father had done in the name of business, but she also wanted it to be a tribute to her grandfather. Though he had passed while she was still young, she still had fond memories of sitting on the man's lap and listening to his wondrous stories about his time at the company. She knew now that a lot of them were completely exaggerated, but the sentiment was always the same. His stories always carrying the same message of their duty to help people, and she hoped that, wherever he was now, the chip would make him proud. With so much in her life finally beginning to change for the better, it was hard not to feel content in that moment. Even the buzzing scroll in her pocket couldn't dampen her mood as she pulled it out and saw the caller was an unknown number. Normally that meant it was some tabloid journalist who had managed to find her number and was looking for anything she could give. Just as she was about to hit decline and block the number, as she usually did, the call ended and seconds later a text message appeared on her screen. "It's Blake." Within another couple of seconds, the device began to buzz again and Weiss quickly answered. "Good afternoon, Blake," Weiss said, and leaned against her balcony railing, the back of her shirt's collar lifting up slightly to allow a small chill to run down her back. "Sorry, grabbed your number from Yang's phone. I should have sent a text first," the fauna said from the other side of the call. "I can only imagine the people who call you." "Believe me, you can't," Weiss sighed, the shiver that ran down her back having nothing to do with the wind as she remembered some callers who had been creepy enough that she had actually changed her number. "So what makes you call anyway?" "Yang's figure. HT is in 2 hours," Blake replied, her voice out a little halfway through and sounding breathy on its return. "You're still coming, right?" "Yes," Weiss replied suspiciously as a small commotion sounded on the other end of the call. "Seal is covering my meeting." "All right, TH then," Blake sighed, though Weiss recognized it as a sigh of pleasure rather than exasperation. "Blake, please tell me you are not with Sun right now," Weiss groaned, fairly certain of the answer to her question already. Maybe," Blake said quietly, and let out a small yelp. "Look, just be at the Signal Gym in an hour so I can show you where to watch without people seeing you." Without bothering to wait for an answer, Blake hung up and Weiss couldn't help but shake her head, an amused smile teasing at her lips. She was happy that, while she had yet to get to the work issues at her company's warehouses, Blake and Sun were at least getting some time together. The girl had seemed a little more down than usual from Sun constantly being called, and so Weiss was happy they were still going strong because, as Yang had said, the boy really did make her smile. However, While Weiss would have loved to stay on her balcony to enjoy the blissful winds a little longer, Signal was quite a distance from her mansion, and she knew that there would be the usual hassle of dodging the press, so with a small sigh to herself, she moved back into her room and closed the balcony doors. She was actually rather excited to watch Yang's fight. While Yang had said it was only a friendly bout, she knew the girl had been training so much that since the night she had spent over that there had been almost no communication between the two. They still talk every night, of course, but Weiss had been insistent on ending the conversations quickly so that the blonde could get her rest. However, this meant that she had been missing the girl terribly. It had been tough during their infrequent meetings in the previous weeks, but not seeing her at all and barely hearing her reassuring voice had left her feeling slightly empty all week. Quite often she had found herself thinking back to the night spent at Yang's house, letting the memory of how it felt envelop her, and more often than not lately, it was the memory of laying in her girlfriend's arms, hearing the gentle thudding of the girl's heartbeat in her ear as she rested her head against Yang's chest, that aided her in falling asleep. "You seem happy, sister?" The completely unexpected voice caused her to let out a small, startled yelp as she turned to face the doorway where her brother Whitley was leant against the frame, the usual fake, obnoxious smile on his face. "It looks good on you," he said, his voice sickeningly sweet. "What do you want, Whitley?" Weiss asked as she squinted at the boy. Normally, he would simply avoid her where he could, but occasionally he would attempt to get under her skin with vague insults. Just came to ask my dearest sister something," he replied, the smile remaining on his lips. "You see, things around here have been a little odd as of late." "How so?" Weiss asked cautiously, though she didn't hate her brother, pity being a more apt description of her feelings. Weiss' general dislike of him did often cause her to overlook that he was actually very observant. "Well," the boy hummed gently as if he was enjoying the moment. "You have been smiling more. Your attention is now glued to your scroll during dinner, and I couldn't help but overhear that you were playing the piano again." "Do you always pay this much attention to me?" Weiss said condescendingly, as she really didn't like where the conversation was headed. "Only because I care," he said in a way that sent shivers down her spine. She had heard those words from her father countless times, and she couldn't remember them ever being said honestly. "But it's not just you who has been so different lately." "What do you mean?" Weiss asked out of curiosity. She hadn't noticed anything different about anyone else in the mansion. "Well, I swear that when I saw Klein retrieve the usual wine bottle from our parents' room, that there was actually some left in the bottle," he elaborated in a thoughtful tone. "Now it could have just been a trick of the light, but I have never fallen for such a trick before. What do you think, sister?" Weiss gave the boy a hard glare. He was right. The lighting that was set up in the mansion had been done in such a way that it never messed with their vision. That, combined with the fact her mother liked red wine, which was always kept in green bottles that deflected quite a bit of light, meant that what Whitley had seen must have been true. And it was odd. Usually her mother would never even leave a drop before falling asleep. "She may have just fallen asleep early," Weiss said, though she knew her voice had been very unconvincing. Maybe," Whitley said, his grin growing at her tone, and he pushed himself off her doorframe to stand upright. "There was one other thing too." There was no mistaking the glint in his eyes as he said those words, and Weiss felt herself straighten, know that his eagerness was never a good sign. "Supposedly, there is a staff member telling these little stories about you," he said, his eagerness seeping into his voice now. "According to my ears among the staff, she was cleaning our town house early on Monday morning, yet seems to swear that you were nowhere to be seen." Weiss felt her blood freeze a little as she glared into her brother's eyes. The same shade of pale blue as hers, yet the ice held within them was colder by far. She was certain that if he actually knew anything, then her father would know already, so she had to play it off. "Then your ears must be faulty," Weiss said with as much confidence as she could muster. "Or she is simply getting her days mixed up. I do not remember any cleaner during my stay." "Or she is lying," the boy said with an amused grin. "Or lazy, or just simply negligent. Either way, I think it would be prudent to fire her. After all, we cannot have misinformation about our family's ongoings being spread around now, can we?" Damn it, Weiss thought to herself. She was stuck. If she defended the woman, then her brother would suspect something, but if she allowed her to be fired, what would that make her? What would Yang say if she ever found out? She had been disappointed enough at the museum, but this would be so much worse. Just imagining how Yang would look at her sent a pang straight to her heart, and she knew instantly that she couldn't allow that. She couldn't try to build a life with Yang by destroying someone else's. I do not think that is necessary, Weiss said with as much authority as she could. Give me her name and I will talk to her, maybe suggest ways in which she can improve before we take such an action. But why bother when we can just hire someone who already has the qualities we seek? He said pompously, his hand sweeping to the side idly to express his disinterest. There is no end to the commoners that are willing to serve us. If she is spreading rumors about me, then I will be the one who decides her fate, Weiss said, ignoring his last statement and taking a step towards him. Now give me the name and I will resolve this situation myself later on. Whitley hesitated briefly, the smile that had been painted on his face making it hard to determine his thoughts. Weiss didn't know if she had convinced the boy that there was nothing to be suspicious about, and she doubted she ever would, but after a couple of seconds, he finally gave a brief nod. Very well, sister, he with a little bow. I do believe it was a woman named Vila, or was it Violet? It is so hard to remember these days, what with there only being so many colors for people to use and all. Viola? Weiss asked. She was certain her brother knew the name, but she couldn't be bothered to play his games anymore as she had better places to be. Ah, yes, that was the one, he said with a slight chuckle, clearly regarding his own pomp as witty. You were always so good with names. Yes, well, I have places to be. Weiss scowled as she grabbed her bag from her desk chair. So will that be all? I believe so, he said, and turned on his heel to make his way out of the doorway. Are you going anywhere nice? I have a lunch that I cannot miss, Weiss lied, knowing that Whitley was likely to subtly drop the information to her father. Well, have fun, he said insincerely, and walked away out of sight. The conversation with her brother had left Weiss feeling a little worried. Her brother was a pain at the best of times, but he did have a tendency to make sure he knew everything that was happening around him, and if he suspected there was something her didn't know, he would do his best to find out. Unfortunately, Weiss wasn't sure if she had managed to convince him, so with the thought in mind to keep an eye on him, she made her way down to her car to leave for the fight. The smell of waxed wood was strong in Weiss' nose as she entered the building and scanned her surroundings. It was very large, easily the size of a basketball court, and the lines on the floor showed that it was often used as one on occasion, but there was currently a boxing ring placed in the center. She doubted it was an official one and more just one constructed for the public fight. High walls were lined with many different pieces of equipment, from ropes to folded-away climbing ladders, and on the other side were a long set of bleachers where people would easily be able to sit and watch. She wasn't sure how many people there were going to be watching, but from what Yang had said, it wouldn't be too many. If that really was the case, then she would be easily spotted, and was therefore glad Blake had thought ahead. However, Weiss had no idea where to find the girl. She had expected her to in the main room, since that was the most logical conclusion, but obviously she was wrong as the girl was nowhere to be seen. Pulling out her scroll, Weiss typed off a quick message to tell the girl she had arrived and began to walk around the room as something to do. Half a minute later, she felt the device buzz in her hand and looked at what the girl had replied. Corridor at the end. First left. Third door on the right. Looking to the end of the room, Weiss noticed a small corridor she hadn't noticed on her initial inspection as, even though the room was bathed in light, the entryway was shrouded in shadows cast from the lack of light above it and the bleachers blocking any of the other light from reaching it. Suppressing a shiver at the dark space, Weiss moved towards it and followed the direction Blake had given her until she came to what she believed was the door and give it a soft knock. The faint sound of voices that had been on the other end stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps drawing closer to the door as it quickly opened. A girl she had never met before suddenly stood before her in a baggy brown t-shirt and a pair of black shorts. Brown hair, cut to frame her face, stopped just below her ears apart from one lock of orange hair that ran down to her chest. Dark brown eyes like chocolate quickly looked her up and down, but they locked onto her own as her mouth formed into a grin of what Weiss assumed to be approval. Damn, I hope you're here for me, she said in a flirtatious tone, her grin widening to show shining white teeth. Love a girl in an expensive shirt. That's a Cloris hand sewn, right? Weiss stumbled, taken aback by the girl's brazenness, but also impressed by her ability to correctly identify her shirt. You love anyone and anything, Coco, said the tired voice of Blake from behind the girl, who was still grinning at her. I doubt a trash bag would turn you off. So long as it's well made, the girl replied happily, as she leant in a little closer and lowered her voice. Though generally, I prefer people and not. Will you please stop flirting with my girlfriend? Came Yang's voice from somewhere in the room too, the slightest hint of annoyance present in her tone. Come in, Weiss, and ignore Coco. Wait, girlfriend? Coco said, her tone now much more intrigued, and she moved aside to let Weiss enter. Wow, how did a barbarian such as yourself land someone like this? I don't think even she knows, said Blake, who was sat on a small bench by the wall, a book in hand, but her eyes peering over the top. Very funny, Yang pouted as she stood up. Just like the girl they had called Coco, Yang was wearing a pair of shining shorts and a baggy t-shirt, though hers were yellow instead of brown. Shouldn't you get back to your own dressing room? Right, guess I will see you in the ring. Coco nodded, flashing yet another smile in Weiss' direction. I'll try not to mess her up too bad. I know her looks is all she's got. With one last wink, the brunette slipped out of the still open door and left it to close behind her, as Weiss felt a hand slip around her side and pull her close. Her eyes met the preferable lilac of Yang's, and she couldn't help but feel a wave of relief rush through her as she once again found solace in Yang's arms. We are supposed to be a secret, Yang, Weiss scolded the girl, though the scolding was half-hearted at best. There are enough people who know already. I know. The blonde's eyes saddened slightly as she spoke. I just didn't like seeing Coco flirt with you. Weiss narrowed her eyes a little. She couldn't really judge Yang, as she herself had been jealous a couple of times, but with potentially having Whitley's attention turned their way, she couldn't help but be a little more on edge about people knowing. I missed you, Yang said cutely, her bottom lip sticking out slightly, and Weiss felt what little annoyance she had been feeling melt away. I missed you too. Weiss smiled and gave the girl a quick peck on the lips. But please, no matter how jealous you get, no one else can know. All right. Yang nodded and smiled gently as her hand dropped from Weiss' back. I'm sorry. Weiss sighed, the guilt of them having to be a secret because of her once again surfacing. Just. Weiss cut herself off. She wanted to tell Yang about her brother, but she also didn't want to give the girl something to worry about before her fight. Never mind, I will tell you later, Weiss said pointedly, receiving another nod from her girlfriend. All right, well, I gotta get ready. Yang smiled and turned to Blake, who had clearly returned to her book, uninterested in their conversation. You want to show Weiss where she can watch from? Sure, the fauness replied, shutting the book and putting it inside her jacket as she stood up. Good luck, Weiss smiled, and made to follow Blake out of the door, only to feel a hand take her own and pull with enough force to spin her around. She closed her eyes and smiled in anticipation while she span, as she knew what was about to come, and sure enough, she wasn't disappointed. Yang's lips claimed her own in a deep kiss, and the girl's other hand gripped her waist to keep her close, Weiss replying by slinging her free arm around the blonde's neck and pulling her closer. After a week of no contact, the feeling of her lips pressed against the blonde's, the slight smell of lavender filling her nose, was heaven for Weiss. Unfortunately, while she would have loved to have stayed in the embrace for a while longer, Yang pulled back, a shivering breath escaping the girl's lips as her eyes opened. Luck? Yang smiled cockily and released her grip. I'm pure skill. Then you had better show me some, Weiss replied, rolling her eyes and flashing the blonde a smile as she turned and followed Blake out of the door. As it shut, Weiss watched as Yang stuck her tongue out at her and gave a wink. Knowing what was going through the girl's mind, Weiss shook her head free of those thoughts and turned around to see Blake waiting for her. Without a word, Blake began to walk down the corridor, and Weiss quickly took after her. Silence followed them as they walked, a common occurrence Weiss had noticed whenever she was alone with Blake. Without Yang, almost every time Weiss had entered the store to get her coffee for the past week, there had been almost zero conversation. While she had got used to that feeling at home, with Blake it had been a rather stark contrast to their normal interactions. It had even concerned her enough to ask Yang about if Blake actually liked her, but the blonde was quick to reassure her, and just say that's how Blake was normally. So what took you so long to get here? Blake asked dryly, her form starting to fade into the darkness, as they walked down a windowless hallway that was only partially lit. The press, Weiss groaned at the fauness as they turned into a door that led to a set of stairs, thankfully much better lit than the hallways, so she didn't have to worry about tripping. It took you over an hour to lose them? Blake asked with a raised eyebrow as they began their climb. No, Weiss shook her head. I just needed to be a little more cautious today, is all. Oh, how come? Blake asked slowly. Well, there may be a chance that my brother suspects something. Weiss sighed as they reached the top and took a left turn. If her mental mapping was correct, they were now heading back in the direction of the main room. I'm assuming that would be bad, the raven-haired girl hummed. Very, Weiss confirmed. If he finds out, then my father will know immediately. So still no plan for telling him then? No, Weiss sighed. You do realize it only takes one person to successfully follow you, and then the decision is taken out of your hands, right? I know that, Weiss argued. She knew Blake was right, and she had been trying to think of ways to tell her father, but every situation she devised just ended badly in her mind. No matter what she thought up, she couldn't find a way where her father's anger wasn't cataclysmic. So? What will you do if that happens? Blake asked, her tone hard, and it was clear to Weiss the girl expected an answer. You are worried I will leave her? Weiss replied quietly. Yes, Blake answered flatly, as she stopped in front of a door. I know you like her, but I have seen you go out of your way to not be followed, not come to the store because you ran out of time trying to lose them, and even today, you were almost late because your brother might suspect. Blah. Yang may not have shown anything obvious, but when I told her you had texted me that you were here, I definitely saw relief in her eyes. I do not know what I will do if that happens, Blake, Weiss admitted as she looked into the girl's amber eyes. She knew Blake was only asking out of worry for her best friend, so wasn't at all annoyed by her doubts. But I do know that I will not be leaving her. Blake's eyes locked onto her own, her amber orb searching for any sign that she was lying, and Weiss did her very best to make her see just how serious she was. After a couple of seconds, she squinted and let out a short sigh. What will you do if he sends you to Atlas? Weiss blinked. She had not been expecting that. She had certainly thought of that possibility, and even though it was small, it was still a very real one. One that she had no idea how she would handle. She had money put away, more than most people would make in a couple of years, but if her father tried to send her back to Atlas, and Weiss used her savings to stay, she would be saying goodbye to the company permanently. That was the worst-case scenario, and one she had not told Yang about. I see. Blake nodded as she twisted the handle of the door behind her, her face completely unreadable. For what it's worth, I can see how much you care about her, and I really hope it doesn't go that way. Thank you, Weiss said gently. After asking Yang why Blake was always quiet towards her, she now found herself wishing the short walk had been one of silence. You can watch her from here. She should be coming out in around 15 minutes. Weiss gave the girl a nod and stepped into the room as Blake flipped the switch on the wall. From what she could see, it looked like an unused office, the only furniture a small desk and a couple of chairs. On the far end was a window, and Weiss walked over to it to see that it had a perfect view of the gymnasium, where a couple of people were already in the stands. While she would have loved to have sat down there with them to cheer her girlfriend on, she was at least happy that she would have just as good a view from the window. Do you hate me, Blake? Weiss asked as she looked out of the window, sensing that the girl was still behind her. It was a question she had to ask after the uncertainty she had just admitted through her lack of an answer. For forcing Yang to worry like that? Blake didn't reply straight away, but since there was no sound of the door closing, Weiss knew she was still there. The question hung in the air for what must have been a whole minute of unnerving silence. But eventually, she heard soft footsteps approach from behind her and saw Blake appear at her side, her amber eyes looking thoughtfully out the window. Had you asked me that question last month, I may have said yes, Blake admitted, and Weiss turned to look at the girl properly. There was always a hardness to Blake's eyes that made looking into the slightly jarring, like you were being judged, and this time was no different. You're a schnee, Blake sighed heavily. During my time in the White Fang, I was made to believe your family the worst of all the bigots, that you all despised the fauna simply because you thought us lesser, and the actions taken by your father only enforced those beliefs. Weiss could hardly argue with that. Over the years her father had done many deplorable things. Most were swept under the rug, but even the few that were publicly known had been quickly twisted in ways that would make anyone believe they were lies. Hell, for a time, even Weiss had believed they were. So when you started coming into my shop, a shop run by Faunus, and began to flirt with my best friend, all around the time a new controversy about your company had arisen, I couldn't help but be suspicious. Blake continued slowly. So I watched you carefully. Every time you came around, I would keep you in eyesight or listen closely to everything you said, and because of that, I saw something that I didn't expect. Which was? You were kind, Blake answered easily. A little rough around the edges, but you never showed any hate towards me, and even more, you seemed to genuinely like Yang. I was still a little skeptical, of course, but as time went on, and the more Yang talked about you, I began to see that you were nothing like your father. So no, I don't hate you, Blake said, her voice filled with certainty. I don't like that Yang might be hurt at all, but sometimes life sucks and there are things that we just cannot prepare for, even if we know that they may happen. I can see that this is a difficult situation for you too, and that you will do whatever you can to prevent that from happening. I will, Weiss confirmed, wanting to make sure Blake knew she was right on that. But I don't know what to do if he does try to send me away. Yang knows that I am going to lose the company for a while, but I have not told her that I could lose it permanently if I stay when he wants me to go. You're scared she will end it. Would she? Weiss asked, hoping that the girl who knew Yang better than anyone would say no. Most likely, Blake said with a slight nod. Even I often feel she is too selfless for her own good. So what do I do? I'm not sure. Blake sighed and rested her hands on the window's ledge. This may not be my place to ask, but do you love her? Weiss paused and watched as Blake turned to look her in the eye. I do, Weiss admitted after a second, as she looked into Blake's glowing amber eyes. She had been thinking on that question all week and had finally accepted that she did. While she knew that it was very soon, her visit to the piano room had provided the clarity she needed to stop doubting it. Then I would suggest that you wait it out, Blake said, her voice softer than before. Take the time to figure it out, and then you can work on trying to make sure it doesn't happen. But you will have to tell Jan the truth at some point. I know, Weiss groaned. I would just rather wait until we have a plan on how we are actually going to tell my father first. Well, that is for you and Jan to figure out, Blake said as she returned her hands to her pockets and straightened herself up. Speaking of which, I should get back downstairs. Of course, Weiss said with a nod. Thank you for being honest, Blake. Yeah, well, like how I think Yang is often too selfless, Yang often thinks I'm too honest. Blake shrugged. Well, it is an admirable quality to me. Weiss smiled as she turned back to see more people sitting on the bleachers and managed to pick out Ty from the crowd. It is a rare thing in my life for someone to be so. I really do hope things turn out for the best, Weiss, Blake said with a small smile. I may not have known what to think of you at first, but now I consider you a pretty decent person who really does deserve someone like Yang. Thank you, Weiss replied, feeling a little warm inside. After her doubts of whether Blake even liked her, it was good to have them put to rest. No problem, Blake nodded. Anyway, I really should go. Enjoy the fight. Coco is pretty tough, so it should be a good one. With a short wave, Blake made her way out of the door and shut it behind her, leaving silence in her wake. Returning her gaze back to the window, Weiss thought about the conversation she had just had as she waited for Yang to come out. She felt Blake had been fair in everything she had said, and knew that the girl was right in saying Weiss had to tell Yang. After minutes of thinking on both how she could tell Yang the truth and how they could go about telling her father, she saw Yang emerge from the dark hallway she had walked through earlier, and as she walked over to Blake, who had already taken her seat next to Ty, the blonde raised a hand to her mouth and blew a kiss in Weiss' direction. Feeling a smile pull at her lips, Weiss decided that she was finally going to have to do something drastic if she was going to figure out a solution to her problems. Pulling her scroll from her purse, she found the desired recipient and typed off a short message. Dear Winter, I know you are quite busy and that you said this number was solely for emergencies, but a lot has happened in the short few months since you last visited, and I am genuinely unsure about what to do. Your advice has always been of great value to me, and now I could use it more than ever. I am not asking for you to time away from your busy schedule to visit, but I please ask that you call me when you have a moment to spare. Your sister, Weiss. Taking a deep breath, Weiss gave the message a once-over. She knew Winter would reply rather quickly if Weiss sent a message to the number she had chosen, but did she really want to use it? Winter had made it clear that she could, that the number was one that only Weiss had, but she knew her sister was incredibly busy. Unfortunately, though, she needed the help. Never before had she been so torn on how to do something, so it was with a shaky finger that she clicked send, determined to enjoy her girlfriend's fight while she waited for a reply. Chapter 18. Beginning the process. Weiss Schnee. Could I get a custard donut, please, Amber? Ty said kindly as they approached the store's counter. And whatever the girls want too. The small dessert parlor they had walked into was actually rather nice. Nestled between the shops, the space was only really big enough for 3 for chairs apiece, but the overall feel of the shop was very comforting. Each wall was painted a soft blue with white, pink, and brown streaks running through their center. Dotted around the walls were pictures of desserts, from ice cream to gatto, all of them detailed enough that Weiss wouldn't be surprised if she developed diabetes just from looking at them. Oh! Ruby cooed as she approached the brown-haired cashier whose name tag read Amber. I'll have the deluxe cookie dough cheesecake with strawberry ice cream and chocolate sauce. She'll take a regular, Yang objected, earning a slight nod from the cashier and a small pout from the younger girl. Strawberry sundae for me. Yang paused to look at Blake, who had already taken a seat by the window, her nose planted firmly back into her book. And a slice of black velvet cake. What about you, Weiss? Ty asked as he dug around his pockets. Do you have a plain sponge cake? Weiss asked the woman behind the counter as she reached into her purse and pulled out her card, receiving a confirmatory nod in response. A slice of that, please. As she reached out to hand the card to the cashier, she felt Yang's fingers close around her wrist and turned to look at her girlfriend. What are you do? Yang began, but Weiss cut her off. I am paying, Weiss said resolutely as she gave Yang a pointed look. She could see the thoughts rushing behind Yang's eyes, and, knowing what the blonde was thinking, gave her a gentle smile. I want to. After a brief moment of hesitation, Yang released her wrist, and Weiss handed the card to the woman who swiped it and gave it back. Consider it a reward, Weiss smiled as she placed the card back in her purse and made her way to the table Blake was sitting at with Yang in tow. But I lost, the blonde replied with a sullen grimace. True, Weiss said softly as they sat down at the table, Blake shifting over to make room for them. But you fought well, at least it looked to me like you did. She did, Blake said, her eyes peeking over her book. Coco's got a nasty right cross though. How are you feeling? I hurt all over. Yang groaned as she placed her hands on the table and rested her head on top of them. I'm so not looking forward to tomorrow. What's tomorrow? Weiss asked curiously. Recovery. Blake chuckled as Yang once again groaned at the word. The day after is always the worst. It hurt to even breath last time. Yang whined and raised her head to look at Weiss. Don't suppose I could get taken care of by an extremely attractive nurse, could I? Weiss felt a smile stretch across her lips at Yang's jokingly hopeful face. Even though she was clearly in pain, she still found time to flirt and make jokes. You know I would if I could. Weiss grinned at her. She really would have. The idea of spending another night with Yang was more than tempting. After a week of not seeing her, just the short drive to the dessert parlor cuddled up in the back of Ty's car had felt so nice, and even though her earlier conversation with Blake was still on her mind, the feel of Yang's hand in her own was more than enough to at least let her relax for a time. Looks like you'll have to settle for me. Blake chuckled and placed a hand on Yang's shoulder. Greet, as if the day wasn't going to be bad enough, Yang said with a shiver, earning a raised eyebrow from the fawness. No offense, Blakey, but you know your bedside manner sucks, right? I guess you can take your tired, bruised body downstairs for your own drinks then. Blake scowled indignantly and placed her book on the table. Hey now, I said it sucks, but it still beats getting out of bed. Yeah well, keep talking and you will be walking. Yang, Weiss heard Ruby say as she walked up to the table with a small tray of desserts and sat down beside Blake. Stop being mean to Blake. I'm not being mean. Yang scoffed and placed her hand on her chest in fake insult. Just you wait until she takes care of you when you're sick. Ruby isn't a drama queen. Blake deadpanned and pulled the slice of black velvet cake towards herself. And I actually like her. Excuse me. Yang whined as Ruby stuck out her tongue at her. 1. I am appropriately dramatic, and 2. You don't like me, you love me. You'll have a hard time proving that, said the girl as she shrugged and took a bite of her food. Reaching for her own plain sponge cake, Weiss watched as the 3 girls laughed and joked with each other. She was still new to having friendships like those with Blake and Ruby, and even newer to relationships like the one she had with Young, so it was still a little hard for her to engage in what seemed to be standard conversation between the group. Fortunately, Young always tried to bring her into the discussion. "I have years of pictures," Young said smugly as she spooned some ice cream into her mouth. "Explain them." "Photoshopped," Blake shrugged, earning a giggle from Ruby. "I hate pho," Young began, but simply gave a sigh and shook her head. "You're an ass." "You're a bigger one," Blake countered as she picked her book back up and disappeared behind it with a cheeky smile. "Have a bigger one too." Weiss couldn't help but chuckle at the final statement as it had been said in a quiet mumble, yet it was clear that Blake had still intended for everyone to hear. Almost immediately, Ruby's giggles became full on mirthful laughter, and Young grabbed her spoon to point it at Blake. "My ass is great, but I will gladly accept the consequences of shoving this up yours if you insult it again. I am certain the store will not let you back if you do that to their cutlery, Young." Weiss chuckled at her girlfriend's reaction. "You ain't got a problem with my ass, have you, Weiss?" "I cannot say I have paid too much attention to it," Weiss lied, trying to suppress a blush as she felt heat rush to her face. However, seeing the playfully disappointed look on Yang's face, Weiss quickly changed her answer. "I mean, it is nice, I just pay more attention to other areas." "Oh, I noticed," Yang grinned mischievously. "I meant your face," Weiss quickly rectified, knowing that the blush she had been trying to suppress was now clear as day. "MHM," Yang hummed, her smile wide enough to show her perfect teeth. "Whatever you say, beautiful." "You know what?" Weiss replied teasingly. "I think I am going to side with Blake here." "Huh!" Ruby exclaimed loudly, pointing her spoon at her sister. "Even your girlfriend." "Ruby!" The younger girl's eyes widened as Yang's scolding his quietened her, and Weiss felt another wave of guilt run through her. Yang had just told her sister off because the girl had been so happy that she had forgotten it was a secret. Seeing the girl, who had been smiling only a second ago, now looking sadly at her lap, Weiss hoped that Winter would get back to her soon so that she could start taking steps to make sure things like that didn't happen again. "Sorry," the redhead pouted. "I forgot." "It is fine, Ruby," Weiss said as she tried her best to put on a smile for the girl. "No one is around anyway." "Just try not to slip up again, please, Rubes," Yang said, the remorse in her voice sending yet another stab of guilt through Weiss. "Besides, even they slip up on occasion," Blake said from behind her book, and Weiss watched as she pushed the remaining half of her cake towards the girl. "Yeah, don't beat yourself up, Rubes." Yang smiled at the girl, who had taken a sullen bite of the black and white cake. "Also, where's Dad?" "Outside," Ruby replied glumly, though the new cake seemed to have at least removed the sadness from her eyes. "Said he didn't want to be that old fart hanging out with teenagers." "Sounds like he's finally learning." Yang smirked, and she spooned ice cream into her mouth. "So how long before you gotta head into work, Weiss?" "I am free for the next few hours," Weiss replied. The only meeting she had planned was covered by Seal, so there really wasn't a lot of reasons for her to hurry. "I just have to go in to organize some paperwork, but that will only take an hour or so." "Why do you ask?" "Well," Yang dragged out the word cautiously as she played with her ice cream. "I was wondering if you wanted to swing by my place for a bit. I have something to show you." Weiss eyed the blonde suspiciously as she thought on what the girl could mean. It wouldn't be the first time Yang had used an excuse to drag her into a makeout session, and though Weiss would definitely not be opposed, Yang's house was rather out of the way. If she did go, she wouldn't be able to stay long, or she would risk being late. "Show me what?" Weiss asked cautiously, looking for any sign of mischief in her girlfriend's eyes. "Nothing like that." Yang grinned as she clearly understood Weiss' hesitance. "Liar!" "Shut it, you!" Yang fired back to Blake, whose smiling face was now visible as she had turned her book slightly sideways for Ruby to be able to read it too. "I mean, it's just something I want to show you is all." "I cannot stay long," Weiss said softly. While she knew she would be cutting it close, the intrigue of what Yang clearly wanted to show her, along with the desire to spend more time with the blonde, was enough to convince her that it was worth it. "That's fine." Yang smiled, her beautiful lilac eyes lighting up with happiness. "It won't take too long." Out of the corner of her eye, Weiss saw Blake and Ruby share a look before snickering quietly to each other, earning a scornful look from Yang. Feeling heat creep up her cheeks as she realized what they were snickering at, Weiss was about to defend herself, but the slight buzzing of her scroll caught her attention. Pulling it out, she felt a rush of excitement as she read her sister's name on the caller ID and stood up from the table quick enough to earn a surprised look from all three of the girls. "Sorry," Weiss rushed out, unable to contain her excitement. "I really have to take this." Lingering just long enough to see Yang give an understanding nod, Weiss rushed towards the door and quickly stepped outside. Fortunately, despite it being slightly chilly, her small jacket she was wearing over her shirt was enough to stop most of the wind chill. Taking a deep breath, Weiss pressed the accept button and raised the device to her ear. "Good afternoon, Winter," Weiss said excitedly as she answered the call, only to remember that Atlas was 4 hours ahead of Vale and would just be turning nighttime. "I mean evening." "I do not have long, sister," Winter sighed from the other end. Despite Winter's tone, Weiss knew she would not have called anyone else back so soon. "These changes you mentioned in your message sounded important. What has father done this time?" "Nothing," Weiss quickly clarified. "But he is involved." "Explain." "Well," Weiss hesitated. She honestly didn't know how Winter would react, so decided to keep the admission simple. "I have begun to date someone." Weiss paused, waiting to see if Winter would reply. However, after nothing but silence met her, except the sound of voices drifting from the alleyway next to her, she continued. "And it is with someone that father will very much not approve of." As she finished her sentence, she heard a loud sigh issue from her sister, and a new nervousness ran through her. She had been so certain her sister would help, so certain she could turn to her, that she had never even entertained the idea that Winter could be just as against it as their father. "I know it must be serious if you are telling me, but how serious?" Winter asked, her tone even and hard to read. "How long has it been?" 2 months, Weiss whispered nervously. "How serious, Weiss?" Winter repeated, but this time Weiss definitely picked up on the knowing tone in her voice. I love her," Weiss mumbled. "I know it is sudden and I can." "Enough," Winter said firmly. "This is complicated, Weiss." "I can." "Too complicated for the discussion to take place over the phone," Winter interrupted. "There is much you do not know, and to explain fully would take longer than I have right now." "Oh," Weiss replied a little sadly. She had hoped that when Winter called she'd have time to help, but at least she was willing to help another time. "Well, we can arrange a time that works better for you." "No," Winter said firmly. "I will discuss a short leave with General Ironwood. I am owed time away, and I am sure he will understand if I take it now." "Why you are coming to Vale?" Weiss asked. It had been almost a year since she had seen her favorite family member, so the idea of Winter coming to visit was an exciting one. "Yes," Winter replied shortly, and Weiss heard other voices off in the distance, both on her end and on Winter's. "But I must be going. I will message you the information when I know it." "Of course." Weiss smiled, the sounds on her end growing louder, and she swore she recognized one of them. "Goodbye, Winter." "Farewell, sister." As the end call tone sounded, Weiss breathed out a breath of relief. Not only was Winter going to help her, she was coming to Vale. She was finally going to see her sister for the God sake Tai. The sound of Tai's name cut through her thoughts, and Weiss couldn't help but turn her attention to the heated voices she had heard since stepping outside. "Look, I will tell her Sue." "Soon? You have had a month." "And you've had 18 years, Raven." Weiss heard Tai fire back. "Why now?" "I don't owe you an explanation," the woman spat back. "I owe her one. Now either you tell her, or I will go about things my own way." "She is my daughter, Raven," Tai said back, anger seeping into his voice now. "You're the one who left." A slight silence followed at that question, but was eventually broken by a low, angry growl. "Don't you dare," the woman Tai had called Raven replied, the growl enough to send a shiver through Weiss. "Just because my pathetic brother puts up with you, does not mean I will. You are the one who made a mess of everything." "I didn't mean." "Yes, I took my time, but unlike you, I own up to my mistakes while you cower and make excuses," Raven interrupted bitterly. "After everything you did, I do not owe you a damn thing. Now you have a week, maybe having a deadline will make you regrow that sack you apparently used to have." As soon as the sentence was finished, The sound of scraping followed by footsteps heading towards her alerted Weiss to the fact that whoever Tai had been talking to was headed her way. With barely enough time to cover that she had been listening, Weiss took a step away from the alleyway just in time to see a woman dressed in heavy, black leather with red accents walk onto the street. As she met the woman's eyes, she was taken aback by what she saw. Though they were blood red and slightly harsher, they were undeniably Yang's. Weiss had stared into her girlfriend's eyes enough to know them on sight, and as she looked over the woman's face, the similarities only increased. The woman's pitch-black hair that flowed over one shoulder had every curl that Yang's did, curls that Weiss herself had ran her hand through. The woman's face was slightly lined around the eyes, but Weiss knew that if the woman was younger, she could easily pass as Yang's twin. Suddenly everything made sense to her. Why Yang looked nothing like Summer and Ruby looked identical, Tai and Yang's uncle's argument, Blake's reaction when she mentioned it, the conversation she had just heard. It was clear to Weiss that Summer had obviously not been Yang's birth mother. This woman was. Unable to take her eyes away from the woman, Weiss watched as she walked further down the street and pulled a motorcycle helmet over her head while stepping over what looked to be a red and black bike that matched her leather perfectly. Weiss! The sound of her name made her jump slightly, and as she heard the distant rumble of the woman's bike fill the air, Weiss turned to see Tai standing right in front of her. Shock and shame filled his blue eyes as he looked at her, and Weiss couldn't bear to look into them. "I guess that answers whether you heard or not." He sighed and ran a hand through his dirty blonde hair as he glanced where Weiss' eyes had been looking. "Sorry." Weiss apologized, a little ashamed herself at having been caught listening to a private conversation. "I was taking a call and could not help but overhear." "It's fine." Tai shook his head sadly. "Can I ask you to please not mention this to the girls? I'm going to tell Yang. It's just that Raven is a touchy subject with her. This is a family matter." Weiss smiled gently. She wasn't happy about keeping another thing from Yang, especially not something as big as the girl's mother, but she was still new to Yang's life. As close as they had become, the call was not hers to make. Before Tai could answer, Weiss heard the door to the shop open and turned to see Yang looking at them both with a wide grin. Looking at her, Weiss could definitely see that she was right in her conclusion. "Wow!" Yang grinned and leaned against the door frame. "So you would rather hang out in the cold with this old fart than me?" The smile Weiss gave Yang was only slightly forced, the new secret added to the already growing pile that was Weiss increasingly open to the idea of just letting a reporter see them and be done with the secrecy. Well, maybe not that drastic, Weiss thought to herself. "Well, your father is not threatening to put spoons up people's behinds. I'm just going to hope that behind is Blake's and not your sister's," Tai said with a raised eyebrow at his daughter. "Gross, Dad," Yang replied with a fake shiver. "Anyway, you two ready to go? Blake's giving Ruby a ride back once they finish." "Sure." Weiss smiled and followed Yang and Tai to the small car that they had driven in. Though Hazel had driven her to the boxing match, Weiss had decided to travel with Yang and Tai for the day as her car was too easy to spot and, in all honesty, Weiss felt Hazel needed a break. With a cheeky wink, Yang opened one of the back doors for her and Weiss quickly took her seat, Yang slipping in beside her as Tai got in the front. Almost immediately, she felt Yang's hand pass over her own as the blonde's fingers slipped between and held her hand warmly. Feeling a genuine smile stretch across her face this time, Weiss let her head fall back into position on Yang's shoulder, the same position it had taken on their drive to the parlor. However, she knew this drive would a little longer than the previous one, and therefore had more time to enjoy it. "Are you ready for the first thing?" Yang asked with a wide smile on her face. Weiss was stood in front of a door inside Yang's house that, if she had the building mapped out in her head properly, should lead to the garage. She had a fairly good idea of what it was Yang was so excited to show her, but due to that, she was struggling to summon the same kind of excitement, so it was with caution that she gave Yang a short nod. The fire that ignited behind her girlfriend's eye did tempt a small smile from Weiss, but she did her best to look passive until she had seen the death trap Yang was about to show her. "Say hello," Yang said proudly as she twisted the handle and threw the door open while flicking the light switch. "To Bumblebee." As the door opened and the light came on, Weiss was met with the sight of a motorcycle sitting in the middle of the garage. If she could call it that. Weiss wasn't an expert of any form of vehicle by any means, but even she knew that what she was looking at was not street legal. "I sure hope you are not going to be riding that anytime soon." Weiss scowled at the machine that she was almost certain would be the cause of her girlfriend's death. Hey, hey, hey! Yang hushed as she dashed into the room and stood between Weiss and the stripped-down gray death trap. She'll hear you. She has no ears. Weiss smiled as Yang pouted at her. I am pretty sure they fell off at least 30 years ago. She's actually in really good condition. Yang laughed and ran a hand along the dull gray frame. I could take her for a drive right now. But I won't. The final words were only spoken after Weiss had raised an eyebrow at the girl. As much as she liked that Yang was so excited, she couldn't stop being nervous, since the bike looked genuinely unsafe to her. Good. Weiss scowled at the girl and walked over to stand beside the blonde. So I assume you are going to be fixing it? Yup. Yang grinned and sat on the seat of her new bike. With Dad and Ruby, but like I said, it's in pretty good condition, so it really won't take too long. And a qualified mechanic, I hope? Of course. Yang laughed, and Weiss felt a hand close over her own and pull her closer. Coming to a stop between Yang's legs, Weiss found herself looking into her girlfriend's joyful eyes. I get you are worried, but we know what we're doing. I know. Weiss replied and snaked her free arm around Yang's waist, pulling herself into the warmth the girl seemed to perpetually generate. I just don't want to lose you to this. I promise you won't, the blonde said gently. Despite her smile, the tone behind it was clearly serious. Good, she sighed. Pressing her lips gently against Yang's, Weiss let the reassurance wash over her and let herself sink in a little further. You know, Yang smirked as she pulled back and bit her bottom lip. I had this dream the other night when we got this delivered. Oh, Weiss replied, stealing another small kiss. And what was that? Wheel. Yang grinned and wrapped her own arm around her Weiss waist. We were on Bumblebee. I am never getting on this thing, Weiss interrupted with a playful scowl. But continue. I will get you on it, Yang laughed. But we were riding along this cliffside that I remember in Patch, and we stopped at this spot I know that had just the most amazing view of the island. And you were sitting on the back of Bumblebee. Cutting herself off, Yang placed a quick, purposeful peck on Weiss' lips and electricity tore through her body. And we were kissing. Another breathtaking kiss was placed upon her. Then you pulled away and gave me this look. Yang paused, and the look in the blonde's eye made Weiss' heart skip a beat. Like I was the only person in the world. It was Weiss' turn to kiss the girl she loved. While she knew it was how she felt, the timing still didn't feel right to say it, so she hoped that the gesture was enough to convey how right Yang was. Pulling back, Weiss tried her best to look at Yang how she imagined she had in the girl's dream. Kinda like that, Yang whispered, and Weiss was glad that Yang had understood. But I woke up feeling so lucky just to have you in my life, to know that dream could be a reality one day, so I've almost finished something I have been working on for a while. And what is that? That. Yang smiled happily, recovering from the gentle atmosphere that had surrounded them. Is the second thing I want to show you. And I think you will like this one much more. Not very difficult. Weiss grinned, earning a raised eyebrow. Once again, Yang pulled Weiss into a kiss, but this time she stood up as their lips met and exhilaration pulsed through her at the sudden height difference. While she would have liked it to continue longer, Yang pulled away rather quickly and began to pull her back towards the main house. I'll just go grab it. Yang smiled as they reached the hallway and made her way up the stairs. Smiling happily to herself, Weiss walked to the living room and sat on the couch. Yang's dream had sounded nice, and she decided she would love to make it a reality one day. Maybe without the motorcycle, though. However, she was now very curious as to what Yang could be getting that she would enjoy. Fortunately, it didn't seem like she would have to wait too long as she heard Yang's boots on the stairs, and after a couple of seconds, the blonde reappeared holding what looked like a small drawing pad in her hands. Okay, Yang breathed as she sat down and fiddled with the edge of the notepad, seemingly looking for a specific page. It's not entirely finished, but it's close. Weiss watched Yang pull open the book, a slightly nervous look on the blonde's face as she passed it over to her. Weiss wasn't quite sure what she was looking at first, but the image of Yang in a crop top suddenly came to her head as she recalled the black, flaming heart that had been on it, though the one in the book seemed much more detailed. Instead of solid black, the majority of it was now a mix of yellow and orange. The yellow fire swirled at the bottom into the shape of a heart, slowly turning orange as it reached the actual flames that rose gently from the top. Around the entire thing is a black outline, the black reaching down between the flames to make the heart shape itself more abstract and require a second glance. "This is nice, Jan," Weiss smiled as she surveyed the work. It really was. While it looked rather simple, the subtle design and blending of the colors worked really well together to make the page feel like it was actually beginning to burn. "But why would I like it?" As she asked, she feared the answer was something that should have been simple, that she was missing something that she should have noticed. But thankfully, Yang's smile widened a little. "Well," Yang said quietly and moved a little closer. "The dream made me realize how badly I want everything with you. I want that day, I want that look forever, and most of all, I want us to have a future." Yang paused and tapped the drawing in Wei's hand. "But I have a past," Yang continued. "And that past left a mark that I know you can't stand to look at. So I want to get it covered." Yang, Wei sighed and reached out to take her girlfriend's hand. "I really appreciate the gesture, but you don't have to." "I know," Yang smiled. "But I want to. I've wanted to cover it for a while, and now I actually have a reason." Weiss didn't know what to think. She was still reeling from Yang's admission of wanting to have a future with her, but to permanently scar her body just to make sure Weiss didn't have to see those slashes. Taking another look at the drawing, Weiss couldn't argue that it would be a better sight than the bitter reminder of regret. "What does it mean?" Weiss asked carefully. Artists always had a reason for what they drew, and she wanted to know what made Yang's. "Ruby and Blake sort of made it," Yang replied fondly as she traced the outline with her free hand. "I mean, I improved it, but they made me heart-shaped cookies for one of my birthdays, Ruby's idea, and used yellow icing to decorate them. They said I was a dragon with a heart of gold." "That's sweet of them." Weiss smiled as the story. "Long as dragon in Australian, right?" "Yeah." Yang grinned happily. "The basic shape of it kinda stuck with me." Taking one last look at it, this time knowing just how much it meant to Yang, Weiss knew she could definitely grow to love seeing it. "So? Do I have your approval?" "You don't need my approval, you brute," Weiss said, and looked up to meet her girlfriend's eyes that were full of hope. "But, yes, I do quite like it." "Told you would." Yang laughed as she pulled the pad out of Weiss' hands and placed it on the table. "But..." Weiss rolled her eyes as Yang leaned in and gently pressed their lips together. Weiss knew that, despite what Yang had said in the store about not asking Weiss over to fool around, there would definitely be some. She was also certain that if Yang hadn't started it, she definitely would have. Slinging an arm around the back of Yang's neck, Weiss gently pulled her girlfriend deeper into the kiss, the gently fluttering kiss quickly becoming more heated as she felt Yang's hand softly grip her waist. With a soft groan at the feeling, Weiss let herself begin to lean backwards. If her own dreams had told her anything, it was that she really enjoyed when Yang took control, so it didn't surprise her at all that she felt her breath hitch a little as Yang understood, rising to her knees from the sitting position she was in and carefully positioning herself over Weiss. Smiling inwardly, Weiss reached out her arm out to grab Yang's t-shirt, but felt the blonde flinch slightly as she grazed the girl's ribs, causing her to let out a muffled hiss into her mouth. "Sorry," Weiss mumbled guiltily. In the moment, she had completely forgotten Yang had just spent 5 rounds getting punched all over. "It's fine." Yang breathed and reached down to move Weiss' hand down. "Just a little lower." "You wish." Weiss grinned mischievously, causing Yang to chuckle. "You have no idea." Weiss was about to reply, but Yang once again pressed her lips hard against her own, and Weiss followed her girlfriend's request and placed her hand on the girl's hip. Taking in the scent of lavender that permanently surrounded Yang, Weiss pulled her in closer and felt Yang's teeth gently nip at her bottom lip. As she felt a jolt of electricity make its way down her spine, she used her thumb to trace the waistband of Yang's jogging bottoms, earning a small groan from the blonde that only encouraged Weiss further. Feeling a little more courageous, Weiss hooked her thumb under the elastic and pulled gently before releasing it, earning a loud groan from Yang. Further emboldened, she grabbed the band again and pulled a little lower before one again letting it snap back up. However, that time there was no groan, and Weiss felt Yang's lips stretch into a smile. "And you say I'm a tease?" she breathed, and Weiss felt Yang's hand slide from her waist to her stomach. Before Weiss could reply, she felt Yang's fingers slip through the holes between her buttons and pop open the bottom two with practiced ease. Since their relationship had begun, Weiss had had her hands beneath Yang's tops multiple times. But for the first time, Weiss felt Yang's fingertips brush against her bare stomach as she pushed the fabric aside to expose Weiss' stomach and lower ribs. "Want to continue teasing me?" Yang chuckled, and Weiss felt a hand touch her, the touch so light that felt like wind skittering across her skin. However, the touch was still enough to make Weiss gasp a little. She knew Yang was always warm, but the hand that was touching her stomach felt like fire, its heat instantly radiating out across her body. Wanting to feel it properly, Weiss grinned at the girl whose face was hovering inches above her own, lilac eyes filled with challenge and affection, and moved her hand upwards, just high enough for her fingertips to reach the waistband. Seeing Yang bite her lip was all the encouragement Weiss needed to slip her hand beneath the bottoms, her fingertips grazing against plump flesh. "You said you wanted my hands lower." Weiss giggled at Yang's surprised face. "You are?" Weiss would likely never hear what she was as the feeling of Yang's hand firmly placing itself on her, its index finger tracing her ribs, caused her to pull Yang into a deep kiss. As she felt Yang's hand glide gently across her stomach, Weiss allowed the tingles to overtake her for a moment. All week since she had spent the night with Yang, she had been dreaming of that morning, of how it had felt, how safe she had felt, and now once again back in Yang's embrace, she had to remind herself that they were waiting. If she was honest with herself, that rule was one she was wanting to break more and more. Every time she was with Yang, it just felt right that she struggled to care, but of course, that was why she had the rule. Because she cared. She never wanted Yang to feel used. She didn't want things to happen only to have to rush off straight after. So it was with a deep sigh that she knew Yang had felt. She pulled her hand from Yang's bottoms and gently reached up to move Yang's hand away from her stomach. "Sore," Weiss began, but was cut off by a raised eyebrow. "It's fine, Weiss." Yang smiled and leant back into a sitting position as Weiss rebuttoned her shirt. "I should not be teasing you like that." Weiss shook her head and looked at Yang, trying her best to keep the longing out of it. "I like the teasing." Yang chuckled and stuck her tongue out. "That is not the point." Weiss smiled at her girlfriend's behavior. "I know." Yang grinned. "But at least I know once we are out, then we won't have too many issues getting things going." "True." Weiss chuckled. Even when disappointed in her own actions, Yang somehow dragged smiles out of her. "That is actually something I need to discuss with you about that. When we have SE." "No," Weiss interrupted with a roll of her eyes and took her girlfriend's hand. "I meant us telling my father." "If it means I get to brag about you openly, I'm all ears." Yang smiled, though it was clear from the look in her eyes that she was paying full attention. "Well, I spoke with Blake before your fight," Weiss admitted, earning a raised eyebrow in response. "And she made it clear that we need to start seriously thinking about it before we don't have the option to do it on our terms." "I guess she has a point." Yang agreed with a nod. "She usually does." "I thought so too." Weiss smiled and gave Yang's hand a squeeze. "That is why I contacted my sister?" "Winter?" "Yes," Weiss confirmed. "She has more experience handling father than I do, and I was hoping she might be able to help us." "I guess that makes sense," Yang said hesitantly. "Was that who called you earlier?" "Yes," Weiss said nervously. "She said she is coming to Vale soon to talk about it properly." "Does that mean she's going to want to meet me?" "Most likely," Weiss smiled. In truth, she was nervous about Yang meeting Winter, as she knew her sister could be a little harsh, especially when it concerned her. "I should practice speaking properly then," Yang joked, but the way she was playing with her boots gave away her anxiety. "When is she coming?" "She said she will let me know," Weiss answered as she watched Yang pull at her laces. "Are you okay with that?" "Yeah," Yang said unconvincingly, and Weiss tried her best to meet the girl's eyes. "Just worried she won't like me. I know your father isn't gonna like me, but this is your sister. I know you love her like I love Ruby, and I'm not exactly in the same league as your family." "True," Weiss said quietly as she reached up to cup Yang's cheek and finally meet her eye again. "You are so much more. My family may have money, but Winter doesn't care about that, and neither do I." "But what if she doesn't?" "Then she doesn't," Weiss shrugged. "But even if she cannot see in you what I do, I doubt she will try and stop us. She has always tried to make sure I take my own path, so I do not think she will change that." "I hope you're right." Yang smiled shyly and Weiss placed a small kiss on her lips. But don't you have to go? She really did. Weiss knew she was already cutting it close, but she didn't want to leave Jan with doubts, so she shifted herself a little so cuddle up against her girlfriend, her head resting against Yang's shoulder. I think I can take another 10 minutes, she sighed happily, pulling out her scroll to tell Hazel when to arrive to pick her up.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.